And then earlier this year, as we were talking about what do we do with our federal funds, that's kind of the background of the context of these comments, but our detailed budget planning for 22, 23, 23, 24 obviously needs to start now, and more thoughtful decisions can be made along with public input if we desire about what would be reduced in spending or if a referendum should be considered to increase revenue. So I think that's kind of where we're going to be going. Just a little bit more background though on how did we get to this point. Well, since our budget is 77% based on staff, I think it's quite obvious that if we grow our students at about 8% over a 12-year period, but we grow our staff at 30%, we're adding staff at a faster rate than we are bringing in new students, and that doesn't quite work in the long haul. And again, like I said before, what's been masking that is all these open and vacant positions we have in the budget, and when we assume for forecasting purposes that they'll all be filled, because that's the intention, we want to fill them all. If we were to fill them all, it just leads to this large gap. Also, that's what's been masking is these federal funds. We've been able to do things, start things, be spending money, because we've had this federal COVID funding sitting there willing to backstop our expenditures. I'm not going to go through you can look at this later. I just basically go through all of our paid students. So this is the number of actual paid average daily memberships we had year by year, all the way back to 11, 12. And the budgeted FTEs we had all the way back to 11, 12. So back then we were just shy of 16,000 students, and we had 2,100 staff. And jump ahead, where we're projecting for 22, 23 is that we'll be at 17,256 paid students, and we'll be at 2,760 full-time equivalent positions. So we've grown 1,300, we're projecting to have grown 1,300 students, but have added 650 staff. So in other words, for every 2 students, we've added 1 above. And the numbers, again, are catching up to us, and we can't probably afford to continue doing that without making some changes. So where do we go from here? Again, we're not here to recommend specific solutions tonight. We were just brainstorming the 3 legs of the options we have here. We need to talk to the board about salary increase amounts. We know that our employees need to get their paychecks resolved, so we need to talk to you about some guidance and direction on that. We also need to talk about our staffing ratios. So we're going to be dealing with that over the next month, and we'll be bringing you some recommendations in January on how to deal with staffing ratios. Because we want to get going on staffing for next school year in early February. We need to determine how much federal COVID funding should go towards maybe buying down some of that deficit, if we should decide to do that. And should we use any of our savings account? These are the short-term levers that we kind of move around and use all of them to some extent. Long-term, we're going to have further discussions about the numbers of staff we have versus compensation. When we've been adding staff at the rate we've been, it's had an effect that's been holding down the compensation of our current staff, because to buy more positions, we've done it to some extent on keeping our level of increases lower than our peers. We need to talk about student enrollment. Are there ways that we can increase that? I'm on that subcommittee of strategic planning, so I'm very anxious to see what strategies we come up for that. We need to continue our advocacy at the legislature. It was announced today, $7.7 billion surplus. I've never heard a number that large out of the state before. Perhaps there's an opportunity that some of that could be directed to schools, all schools, and help all of us with some of the expenses we're struggling with there. And then we do need to have the discussion about the timing of when and how much we would potentially see through operating or capital projects, which is also known as a technology referendum. I really think one funding bucket that we have not ever accessed is that capital projects referendum, where we get a dedicated amount to fund our technology. We're funding that all through other revenues, so it's really diluting what we have available for our general operations, where other districts have set up the technology referendum, basically provide consistent, sustainable funding for their technology programs. And then we'll want to talk to you too about the policy for the fund balance. Are we at the right amount? Are we calculating it the right way? I think hopefully Kathy, that's on the list of 65 maybe coming up next year so that we can have a discussion with you about that. Over the next few weeks, the Budget Advisory Group, as I kind of came up with that name last night, is going to be meeting so that we're prepared to give a recommendation to the superintendent, who will bring that forward to you on January 11th. That will have kind of some initial parameter setting of which we would propose to operate within, and then we want to move into staffing. We probably, in between January 11th and February 7th, have to have another meeting with you though, just full disclosure, to talk about then even some more specifics. Because we won't have the whole problem solved and not predicting by January 11th, but we at least want to have a roadmap for you and get some feedback and then come back with even more detailed plans after that. And then, of course, staffing comes up, and then we go into May, where we will bring forward an approved budget that probably uses some of all of those strategies, and maybe even a couple others that I can think of that will introduce. That's the high-level overview of the financial forecast. I know it's not great. I don't want to pin it on anybody and say that this is somebody's fault. I think this has just been a lot of circumstances over time. I think also when we had 600 students withdraw at the fall of 2020, that kind of exacerbated the problem there too. And we haven't maybe necessarily done all the tweaks we could or should have for staffing to be done.
Do you have questions, comments?
Oh, okay, I'll leave now.
Oh, that was so close. Ms. Anderson.
Here's the third. Two. The superintendent mentioned that we are adding a study session on January 25th. How does that fit into the way we go from here? Sorry.
Dr. Nathan, it would be one of several sessions that I believe would be prudent for you to have in order to consider options. And so I think if we meet on the 7th, I'm going to put this in not super sophisticated terms. The 7th of January, I think we can present you with some options for the buckets, which is to say reductions, federal funding, other fund balance. I think based on the feedback we get from you on the buckets, by the end of January, we could bring to you strategies within those buckets. And that still puts us, I think, on a decently early timeline to begin to staff and budget schools. So I know when we talk about the annual calendar tonight, we're recommending the addition of that study session on the 25th of January. I would argue, unless we absolutely can't avoid it, only focused on budget issues so that we can really go dig deep at that time. And we may need to add some others in the spring as well.
Ms. Anderson, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a note up in it question, so no, it's got all my numbers up there. I'll help you walk backwards in the timeline. If we don't do anything at all, and all of your projections are correct, we are in really big trouble for the school year that ends in 2025. Like, we just can't approve that budget because we would be out of money, right?
I would say that would be the school year of ends in 24.
2024 will actually be having to borrow money to continue. It's the whole FY thing that all this messes with here. Okay, so absolutely 100%, no matter what, we have to either come up with more money or make cuts in the springtime of 20. Individuals. Because it ends in 24, but it begins in 23, so it's the spring of 23 that we would be having to and if we waited that long, that wouldn't be that great either. So, but spring of 2023 is really only 1 year away.
That's right.
Now, if we were to pursue an operating referendum in order to collect it in time to keep us out of that, because this is the other thing I had written down and now I don't have it written down anymore. it would have to pass when in order for us to collect it in time, because there's a significant delay in time.
To affect the 23-24 school year, where we would be basically have spent all our savings up at that point, you need to pass a referendum in the fall of 22 to increase funding, if you don't want to use any expenditure reductions as a possibility.
And so in order to pass a referendum in the fall of 2022, we would have to authorize it by August?
August of 2022, there would be an exact date that we can track down later, but correct, you're like 10 months away from needing to call that election. 8 months away from calling that election.
And if we did some budget cuts, we would be able to potentially delay that by a year.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. I haven't mapped out a whole lot of different scenarios, but yes, assuming if you could use some federal funds, we could make some spending reductions, you could probably delay your vote to the fall of 23 to be used in the FY 25, which is the 24-25 school year.
Yeah, my eyes are crossing with all those 20, 23, 24, 25. As a individual before I was on the school board many, many years, I've been involved in the Vote Yes community group for referendums. And as somebody who's experienced that, it's very difficult for the Vote Yes group to organize and get things moving without at least a year warning. To start those efforts, it's just a lot to ask of a group of volunteers who it's not their full-time job, and they very often have other full-time jobs. So we're already within that 12-month countdown if we were to look at. So even though the state requires us to take action in August as a board, that is way too late to expect a coordinated effort between the school district and any community groups to happen. I would urge the administration and the board to consider, if we're going to pursue something in the fall, that we have very few weeks to think about it. And can I keep going? Because it's just, there's an awful lot up here. I would say the same thing in regards to the budget cut process, that if it were a small, and perhaps you have it in your 80 pages of documentation, but we've had a number of budget cuts in the past, and some of them have been involving the community to greater extent, and some have been just internal, where staff administration decides on their own, because it's a smaller number, and they identify the cuts that are needed. Do you recall off the top of your head what magnitude those internal efforts were compared to the around 10 million was the last time we had a really big community effort, I think?
For sure. Over the last few years, we've handled up to a couple million as a cabinet and a superintendent, and recommended those to you without doing an extensive process of asking for a lot of input into that. We felt at that level, 1% of the budget we could handle, pretty easy. This is going to be a little bit larger than 1%.
Is it accurate to say it's the largest budget cut we've ever had to make as a district?
Off the top of my head, I would say yes, because I seem to remember 10 and 11, although they were almost back to back, so it was almost, probably felt like it was doing 20, but it was kind of spread across 2 different years.
Right. So I would also put forward to my fellow board members that if we were to authorize some sort of a interactive community effort, which I personally think is really wise, because as a participant in one of those processes, it was very educational to me and to my fellow community members. It's so easy to look in from the outside and say, oh, well, this is easy, you need to cut this or that, but when we get educated by the finance department about what things we are and are not allowed to cut, or we think we'd be saving money, but it doesn't actually save money from the right place, or whatever that be. Budget cuts are very painful, and I think the more we can involve the community so that they can learn about it themselves and feel like that they have input and agency, so to speak, that the community starts to own a little bit of it as well, and that ties in directly with referendum efforts, because when there are individuals in the community who are very involved or respected or, you know, what have you, then they go out and they say, no, this really is a thing. It's not just, you know, we're paying people too much. It's that that's how much we have to pay them to fill all our positions or whatever that may be. Then that's the message that will go out at a time that we have our referendum vote on additional dollars that we may need, and it's cyclical. You know, the one adds to the other, which adds back to the one. Involving people in budget cutting efforts will involve people in referendum decisions. I know I'm rambling, but the idea is that we're probably a year behind on both of those efforts now.
Again, it's, and Mr. Brown has that question too, it's a lot of information and important information. It's certainly something we need to digest, and that we will be discussing this in depth in the very near future. Mr. Brown.
You and I were thinking on similar lines. I just wanted to be sure. Director Adamson's raising very important issues. Were these the type of things, John, that you were planning on presenting or addressing in our study session?
Yes. In my mind, the referendum would be part of that discussion. I don't know how detailed maybe the superintendent would want to go on that, but I certainly think that we would want to at least talk about a couple of the options we have, and then from there see where that leads us.
And to, again, I appreciate what Melissa's saying. I don't necessarily want to add my 2 cents worth at this point. If I can be assured, though, that of this one thing, I'll ask it in the form of a question. Did you hear anything Melissa raised as something that was news to you, or something that you weren't anticipating or considering presenting in our study sessions?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Nathan.
So I don't want to have Melissa's head explode, because I have one more referendum question. You say that the current voter approved referendum provides us revenue through fiscal year 26.
That's it.
So I assume when I look at the fiscal year 27 budget, that is assuming we have not renewed the referendum.
That's right. I didn't put that on the slide because I didn't want to shrink down columns anymore. That's in the detailed information that you can see the effect of pulling out or removing the referendum at that point. It's tens of millions of dollars at that point.
So regardless of the other fiscal situation we're in, we would have been considering whether or not to go to the voters to renew a referendum, and in order to generate the revenue beginning in fiscal year 27, we would have to run a referendum no later than 2025. Is that, am I got my time right? Okay. So if it's not in the near term, we didn't have all these other factors to consider. It could be, it would have been in the farther out near term.
That's right. I should Google some more, but this talk about referendums was never supposed to probably go right up to the 10th year of it expiring. A lot of the language we used back in 2015, 2016, 2017 was like, this will likely get us through the 18, 19 school year. Well, look, we made it 19, 20, 21, 21, 22, we'll probably get 22, 23, but it was never meant to last full 10 years. It's just normally not how referendums work.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Mr. Carlson, this is my first time going through this process, so I apologize if this is a stranger off the wall question. Do you have a way to break down, you talked about the vacant FTEs, and that those are somewhat budgeted for in your process. Do you have a way to break those down as to what roles they play in the district in terms of, are they in classrooms, are they in technology, are they in administration? Can you give us more information
I
about that?
definitely can do that. In the budget, adjustments, I did cover it very, very briefly at a very high level, and I was just gonna pull that up.
Is that in one of the other attachments?
It was, yeah, one of our agenda items that went through on consent, but, I just go to the last page of that. It looks like of the 110 vacant positions, 56 were paraprofessionals, and of those 56, 20 were general education, 36 were special education.
36 for
Yep,
special?
yep, and then 22 student nutrition, so that's our food service workers, so I know that even the staff that kind of coordinates all of food services, they go out every day and they're serving lunches to kind of backfill. We have 16 maintenance jobs, so in absence of not having enough maintenance people, then we contract for cleaning companies. Then we have 12 off-schedule positions, which could just be a hodgepodge of different, administrative or supervisory. Some of those might have student contact, like equity specialists would probably fall in that group, but, that one's a little more nebulous on exactly which positions they are. I have to think deeper in the data that I didn't put on here.
And just to follow up on that, is a way to look at that, that if we don't fill those vacant positions, that classroom sizes could get larger? Is that something the community would need to be aware of, that if we're not able to fill those positions or fund them, that we'd be looking at larger classroom
The
sizes?
emergencies are necessarily like, I don't know, in my mind, of teachers standing in front of a classroom. We've got most of those positions filled. These are the supporting roles of helping kids, maybe you're pulling them out for service, maybe you're doing some home monitoring, serving food, I think is a very important thing. Cleaning their buildings is a very important thing. So, yeah, we wouldn't necessarily see larger class sizes per se, if these positions weren't there, but we would lose a lot of the support.
So correct, less services to
Less
students.
services, less support to our teachers.
And to the students.
To the students, of course.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Right, are we, ready to let Mr., I was gonna say ready to let Mr. Carlson go? You're not fired. I know this is gonna be an ongoing, really, really important conversation and a lot of decisions to be made, so thank you, Mr. Carlson. Our next agenda item is 8.04 policy recommendations. This is the first reading.